Knox Mercer hadn't slept in 3 days, and it wasn't the federal indictment keeping him awake. It was the photograph. A surveillance shot, black and white, grainy from a courthouse hallway camera. A young woman in a cheap blazer carrying 3 boxes of evidence toward a grand jury room. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't posing. She was just walking, chin up, shoulders set, the way someone walks when they've learned early that no one's coming to carry the weight for them. Her name was Felicity Davenport, 29, assistant district attorney out of the Southern District of New York, and she'd just been handed the case that could put him away for life. That alone wouldn't have rattled him. Knox had buried worse threats before breakfast. What rattled him was her left hand, the way she pressed her thumb into her palm when she was thinking. His mother used to do that. His 4-year-old sister used to do that, right before they took her. 25 years ago, a little girl named Rosalind Mercer vanished from the sidewalk outside a preschool in Newark, New Jersey. They found her pink plastic bracelet on the pavement. They never found her. Knox was 12. He'd promised his dying mother he'd bring her home, and every night since, he'd opened a tin box on his desk and stared at that bracelet like it could tell him where she went. Now he ran an empire, the kind you don't discuss at dinner parties. He'd killed men. He'd ruined men. And none of it had brought her home. 3 weeks later, his right hand, Perry Shaw, cracked a dead man's safe and pulled out a forged adoption record. A child listed as Jane Doe number 7742. Birth date matching Rosalind's to the day. Last known name on the file, Felicity Davenport. The prosecutor building a case to destroy him was his sister. Knox sat in his office above the Connecticut shoreline, the file open on his desk, the tin box open beside it, and for the first time in his adult life, the most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard didn't know what to do with his hands. If this story's already got you hooked, hit that like button so more people can find it, share it with someone who loves a good thriller, and subscribe now, because this one's just getting started. Now let's go back to where it all began. A sidewalk in Newark, a pink bracelet on the pavement, and the day Knox Mercer's world broke for the first time. Newark, New Jersey. In the fall of 1999, St. Mary Kindergarten sat on a quiet street far from the avenue, the kind of street where people let children run ahead of the gate without needing to look back. That afternoon, 12-year-old Knox Mercer leaned against a lamppost, waiting for his little sister to get out of school the way he did every day. He heard the bell ring and saw the children pour out, but Rosalind wasn't among the crowd. He waited another minute, then 2, then started running along the sidewalk, calling her name. He found the pink plastic bracelet lying on the road, right beside the maple tree, less than 10 steps from the school gate. Rosalind never agreed to take that bracelet off, not even when she slept, not even when she bathed. And the fact that it was lying there alone on the cold sidewalk meant someone had ripped it from her wrist. Knox picked up the bracelet and clenched it so tightly the plastic pressed marks into his skin. He didn't cry. He wasn't old enough to understand what was happening. But he was old enough to know that the world had just changed in a way that could never be undone. The police arrived within 20 minutes. Red and blue rotating lights swept across the front of the school, across the iron fence, across the faces of the mothers standing on the other side of the street, with their hands over their mouths, whispering. Knox's mother was Catherine Mercer, a woman everyone in the neighborhood knew never raised her voice. But that afternoon she screamed in the middle of the sidewalk in a way Knox had never heard before and would never forget. That scream wasn't crying. It was the sound of a person being torn away from herself. His father arrived 15 minutes later. Patrick Mercer stepped out of the black car in a 3-piece suit, his face expressionless, but Knox noticed his father's hand trembling when he placed it on his mother's shoulder. Patrick didn't ask the police anything. He looked at the bracelet in Knox's hand, looked at the street, looked at the broken security camera on the lamppost that hadn't worked for 3 weeks, and he knew. He knew at once that this wasn't a random kidnapping. This was Warren Hale. 18 months earlier, Patrick had killed Warren's younger brother in a dispute over the container port in Newark, and the entire East Coast underworld knew Warren Hale was the kind of man who didn't take revenge with bullets, but by taking away the most precious thing a person had. Patrick used every resource, every connection, every dollar he had to find Rosalind. He hired private investigators, bribed police officers, turned over every stone in the Hale empire. Nothing. The little girl vanished as though she had never existed, and every month that passed without news was another month Catherine Mercer sank deeper into the dark. First, she stopped eating, then she stopped speaking, then she stopped leaving her room. 2 years after the day Rosalind disappeared, Catherine died in a bed at St. Barnabas Hospital, her hand still holding her daughter's photograph, and the last thing she said to Knox wasn't goodbye, but a plea. Find your sister. Knox was 14 years old, standing beside his mother's bed, and he nodded. That promise drove itself into his chest like a nail no one could pull out. Patrick Mercer didn't collapse after his wife died. He hardened. He poured everything into only two purposes: finding his daughter and crushing Warren Hale. But Hale was wiser than Patrick had imagined. Warren didn't confront him directly, didn't leave clues, didn't show his face. He simply disappeared into his legal system and waited for time to do the rest. Patrick consumed his remaining days in a relentless search. Each passing year went by without a single trace of Rosalind, and without a single piece of evidence strong enough to convict Warren. When Knox was 25 years old, Patrick Mercer died of a stroke in his office in Connecticut, his hand still resting on a stack of missing children's files. He left Knox a crumbling empire, a list of enemies 3 pages long, and one handwritten sentence in his will that no lawyer was allowed to read: find your sister. Knox took over everything. In the 12 years that followed, he built the Mercer empire 3 times larger than it had been in his father's time. Colder, tighter, more dangerous. He controlled real estate, restaurants, shipping routes, and things no one spoke of by name. He became the man the entire East Coast didn't want to face. But every night, when the mansion went silent and there was no one left for him to wear a mask in front of, Knox opened the bottom drawer of his desk, took out the old tin box, and looked at the pink plastic bracelet the 12-year-old boy had picked up from a Newark sidewalk 25 years ago. He didn't know where his sister was. He didn't know whether she was alive or dead. He only knew he had promised, and Knox Mercer was the kind of man who kept a promise until it killed him, or he fulfilled it. While Knox Mercer spent 25 years searching for his little sister, that very girl was growing up less than a 2-hour drive from him, without knowing who she was at all. On the night Rosalind Mercer disappeared from the Newark sidewalk, that 4-year-old girl was passed through 3 intermediaries before ending up at a bus station near the town of Elizabeth, New Jersey, at 2 o'clock in the morning, alone, with no papers, no name, and not a single piece of memory clear enough to tell. A security guard at the station found her curled up on a plastic seat, her eyes wide open but not crying, and called Child Protective Services. The New Jersey CPS system entered her into the records under the name Jane Doe No. 742. Estimated age around 4. No relatives, no origin. From that night on, the little girl was no longer Rosalind Mercer. She became a number in the system, and that system wasn't kind to numbers. The first foster family in Trenton kept her for 8 months, then returned her because she was too quiet, not bonded. The second family in Camden took the support money but forgot to give her breakfast, and she learned how to take food from the refrigerator before she knew how to read. The third family was a little better, but the husband lost his job, and they returned her after 6 months. The fourth and fifth families blurred together into a chaos of damp, moldy houses, other foster children with empty eyes, and adults too exhausted to truly see her. At 11 years old, she was moved into a group home in Newark, less than 3 miles from St. Mary Kindergarten. And that coincidence would send a chill down her spine years later when she learned the truth. The group home had 14 children, 2 supervisors working in shifts, and one simple set of rules. Don't cause trouble, and don't expect anyone to ask after you. She lived there for 3 years. She learned how to sleep through noise, learned how to eat quickly before the food was taken, and learned how to become invisible, because invisible was safer. When she was 14, just as the system was about to push her out because she was nearing aging out, a 62-year-old woman named Ruth Davenport drove an old pickup truck down from Vermont to Newark to foster her. Mrs. Ruth wasn't the kind of person people imagined when they thought of a foster parent. She was a farmer, her hands calloused from 30 years of gardening and raising cattle, her back slightly bent, her silver hair pinned in a high bun, and she spoke so little that Felicity thought she was mute for the entire first week. But Mrs. Ruth did one thing no one in the 6 families before her had ever done. She didn't hit her. It wasn't that she set a rule against hitting. It was simply that the thought didn't exist in her mind. The same way the thought that the sky should be blue didn't need to be declared, because it was the default. She gave her a small room of her own on the 2nd floor of the wooden house, a window overlooking the fields, and said exactly one sentence on the first day. "This is your home. You can stay as long as you want." Felicity didn't believe her. She waited for the woman to change her mind, waited for the shouting, waited for her suitcase to be thrown out the door. She waited 6 months, then 1 year, then 2 years, and Mrs. Ruth was still there every morning, cooking oatmeal, not asking much, not demanding anything, simply being there. Felicity took the Davenport last name at 16, not because Mrs. Ruth asked her to, but because she wanted to belong somewhere, even if only on paper. She graduated from high school at the top of her class in a small Vermont town where no one knew where she had come from, and she didn't tell them. She won a full scholarship to law school, worked 3 part-time jobs for 4 straight years, waiting tables in the morning, working as a library assistant in the afternoon, and entering data for an insurance company at night. She slept an average of 4 hours a day throughout that time, and never complained once, because she had once slept on the floor of a group home, and 4 hours in a real bed was already a luxury. When people asked her why she chose law, she didn't talk about justice or ideals. She said, "Because I don't want to be powerless anymore," and her eyes when she said it were so cold that the person asking usually didn't ask anything more. She entered the prosecutor's office for the Southern District of New York not because of its reputation, but because it was where the biggest, most dangerous cases were handled, and she wanted to stand across from the most powerful men and tell them what the law was. The Knox-Mercer case landed in her hands on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. Nelson Gould, the department head, placed 3 boxes of files on her desk and said, "This is the biggest fish we've ever hooked. Don't disappoint me." That night, in her 5th-floor studio apartment in Brooklyn, with no elevator, where the dining table doubled as her work desk, Felicity opened the first box, read page after page, and taped Knox-Mercer's surveillance photo to the wall across from her bed. She looked at the face of the man in the photograph, the sharp jaw, the gray eyes, the expression of someone accustomed to controlling everything around him, and she didn't feel afraid. She felt ready. 3 weeks after taping Knox-Mercer's photograph to the wall, Felicity Davenport stood before the grand jury in courtroom number 7 of the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Federal Courthouse in downtown Manhattan. The courtroom had a high ceiling, oak-paneled walls, and the kind of pale golden light that made everything look more solemn than it truly was. 16 jurors sat in 2 rows of seats on the right, most of them middle-aged, most of them tired from having heard 4 other cases earlier that week, and Felicity knew she had about 15 minutes before they began looking at their watches. She didn't waste a single second. She began with a diagram projected onto the screen. Not crime scene photos, not a skull and crossbones or anything theatrical, just a financial chart. The lines connecting Mercer Holdings to 14 shell companies ran through 4 states, money entering through 1 door and leaving through 17 others, twisting through real estate in Manhattan, restaurants in Connecticut, investment funds in Delaware, and finally returning to a main account that, on paper, belonged to a charity with no employees, no office, and no activity at all beyond receiving money. Felicity presented it in a low, steady voice, without rhetoric, without emphasis, the voice of someone who didn't need to persuade because she believed the numbers could speak for themselves. She didn't use the word mafia, didn't use the word criminal. She only said cash flow, structure, pattern, and let the jury connect the dots on their own. That was how she had been taught at the Southern District of New York. Don't tell them the story. Give them the evidence, and let them write the story in their own minds. Knox-Mercer sat in the defendant's row, with Colton Price on his right, his attorney, a 40-year-old man in a dark navy suit, his hair slicked back, his face always carrying the expression of someone calculating 3 moves ahead. Colton took notes constantly, occasionally leaning over to whisper to Knox, but Knox hardly reacted. He sat with his back straight, both hands resting on his thighs, his face expressionless in a way only people accustomed to courtrooms could manage, not because he was calm, but because he knew every movement would be read. But his eyes were different. His eyes never left Felicity. It wasn't the look of a defendant measuring an opponent, not a look of contempt or challenge. There was something else there, something even Knox himself couldn't name, a faint familiarity in the way she tilted her head to the left when listening to a juror's question, in the way she stood, with her weight shifted onto her right leg, as though always ready to step forward, and especially in her left hand, her thumb occasionally pressing into her palm when she paused to think. He had seen that habit in the surveillance photograph, but seeing it in person was different. It was clearer, more real, and it stirred something at the very bottom of memory that he couldn't reach. The hearing ended after 2 hours. The grand jury was dismissed to deliberate. Felicity gathered her documents into her briefcase, stepped into the hallway, and walked toward the elevator. She pressed the call button and waited, her eyes fixed straight on the elevator doors, and she knew he was standing behind her before she heard his footsteps. Miss Davenport. Knox's voice was low, unhurried. The kind of voice so controlled it sounded more natural than nature itself. Felicity turned around. Knox stood about 3 steps away from her, with Colton Price behind him, looking as though he wanted to drag his client away but didn't dare. "Mr. Mercer, your lawyer must have told you not to speak to me." Knox tilted his head slightly, and Felicity realized it was exactly the same tilt she had made in the courtroom 10 minutes earlier. "My lawyer tells me many things. I rarely listen." A moment of silence passed. The elevator opened, but no one stepped inside. Felicity looked into his eyes, gray, cold, but not empty. Something was working behind them, a complete and absolute attention she had never received from anyone before. Most defendants looked at her with anger, contempt, or fear. Knox Mercer wasn't afraid of her. He was studying her, and Felicity realized, with a cold feeling running down her spine, that this was more frightening than any threat. She stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor, and didn't look back. The elevator doors closed. Knox stood watching the steel doors meet, and Colton gripped his elbow, pulling him toward the stairwell. On the way back, in the car, Perry Shaw drove while Knox sat in the back seat, silent for 20 minutes, before saying a single sentence that Perry didn't understand at the time, but would remember for a very long while afterward. "She tilts her head to the left when she listens. My mother did that too." Perry looked at him through the rearview mirror, but didn't ask. Knox turned his face toward the window and added, "Meaningless, forget it." But his voice, when he said the words "forget it," was the voice of a man who knew he wouldn't forget. 2 days after the hearing, Knox wasn't thinking about the case. He was thinking about that tilt of the head to the left, about the thumb pressing into the palm, and about the feeling that something was lying right in front of him and he simply couldn't see it. But on Thursday night, Perry Shaw called with different news. Warren Hale had been hospitalized, pancreatic cancer in its final stage. The doctors said he had a few weeks left, maybe a few days. Knox wasn't surprised. He had spent the past 12 years crushing the Hale empire in a way his father never could. Not with guns, not with blood, but with money. He bought up all of Hale's debts from the underground banks, cut off each shipping route by offering Hale's partners a higher price, bought off every important subordinate, and forced every client to walk away with offers everyone understood couldn't be refused. He didn't need to kill Warren Hale. He only needed to make him wake up every morning and realize his empire was smaller than it had been yesterday. By the time the cancer came, Warren Hale had lost almost everything except the mansion on Long Island and an old office in Newark that no one even wanted to buy. Knox drove to Long Island on a Saturday afternoon. Warren's mansion sat at the end of a road shaded by oak trees in East Hampton, the kind of house that, 20 years earlier, had once hosted parties for 300 guests, but now weeds had swallowed the walkway, and only one housekeeper remained. Perry wanted to go with him, but Knox told him to wait in the car. Knox stepped into the second-floor bedroom, where Warren Hale lay in bed, his skin yellow, his cheekbones jutting beneath a thin layer of flesh, an IV line inserted into his arm, and his eyes, those eyes, still bright in the hateful way of cruel men who were about to die and still refused to let go. Knox didn't sit. He stood at the foot of the bed, his hands in his pockets, and asked the question he had been asking for 25 years. "Rosalind, my sister, what do you know?" Warren looked at him. The silence stretched long enough for Knox to hear the heart monitor beeping in a steady rhythm. Then Warren laughed. It wasn't the laugh of someone amused, but the laugh of someone who had waited for this moment for a very long time. A hoarse, broken laugh choked by phlegm, but his eyes lit up one final time. "You're still looking for her. 25 years and you're still looking?" Knox didn't answer. He waited. Warren coughed for a long while, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Fine. I'll give you something. Consider it a farewell gift. She isn't dead, Knox. I don't kill children. I'm not that kind of man. But I made her disappear. Completely. From you, from your father, from the system itself. I threw her into a place no one would think to search. And I erased every trace so cleanly that even she doesn't know who she is." Knox felt something rise in his chest. Not hope. Something deeper than hope, and more dangerous than hope. Because hope, after 25 years, could kill a man faster than any bullet. His voice didn't shake. but only because he had spent his whole life training his voice not to shake. Warren leaned forward, his eyes locked on Knox's, and the smile on his lips turned into something crueler than hatred. "And this is the best part, Knox. I'm going to make you suffer beyond measure, and you'll never know why until it's too late." Knox stood there for 10 more seconds. Warren said nothing else. He was finished, and the silence after that last sentence was heavier than any threat Knox had ever heard in his life. Knox turned and walked out, without looking back, without closing the door, and drove back to Connecticut in absolute silence for the entire 2 hours. Warren Hale died at 3:17 the next morning, alone, in the bedroom where no one had come to visit except Knox. The housekeeper found his body when she brought up breakfast and called the funeral home. No one called the police because there was nothing to investigate. An old man had died of cancer in his own home. That was all. But Knox didn't wait until Warren died to act. That very night, he called Perry and 3 others to Warren's old office in Newark, a 3-floor brick building near the harbor. Dust thick on the windowsills and the locks rusted. They cracked the safe in the 2nd-floor office. Inside, there was no money, no weapons, only papers. A stack of old legal files, expired real estate contracts, and at the very bottom, in a sealed brown envelope, a set of adoption records. False adoption papers, dated 1999, with the intermediary agency listed as a dissolved law firm Knox knew had been one of Hale's fronts, and the child's name recorded as Jane Doe, number 7742. The date of birth matched Rosalind Mercer's down to the exact day. Perry stood beside Knox under the flickering fluorescent lights of the abandoned office and watched his boss read line after line in the file. He had never seen Knox Mercer like this. Not angry, not cold, but empty. The kind of empty that belonged to a man who had just found the answer to the question of his entire life, and realized that the answer was more terrifying than the question itself. Staring back at him from the final page of that dark file was the name of the prosecutor determined to destroy him. Felicity Davenport. And Knox Mercer understood that Warren Hale's final curse hadn't been an empty threat. Destiny had dealt a cruel hand. The woman leading the state's war against his empire was the flesh and blood he had sworn to protect. Knox didn't trust the file, not because he doubted that Warren Hale had lied, but because 25 years of searching had taught him that hope without proof was the fastest way to destroy yourself. He needed confirmation through science, and he needed to do it without Felicity Davenport knowing. Perry Shaw handled it. During the next hearing at the Moynihan courthouse, Felicity drank water from a paper cup during the recess, set the cup down on the prosecution table, and left the courtroom to call Gould. Perry waited until the room was empty, stepped inside, picked up the paper cup, and slipped it into a zip bag in less than 10 seconds. No one saw him. No camera covered that corner. The DNA sample was sent to a private laboratory in Boston that Knox had used many times for matters he didn't want anyone to know about. The results came back 4 days later. Perry brought the envelope into Knox's office at 8 o'clock at night, placed it on the desk, and stood waiting. Knox opened the envelope, pulled out the report, and read the only line that mattered. The probability of a full sibling relationship with the same father and mother was 99.97%. He read it again, then a third time. Then he set the paper down on the desk, very softly, as if it might break, and he said nothing. Perry waited 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. Knox didn't look up, didn't give an order, didn't react. His eyes were fixed on the paper, but Perry knew he wasn't reading anymore. He was somewhere far away, a place Perry wasn't allowed to enter. Perry stepped back out of the room, closed the door gently, pulled a chair into the hallway, and kept watch. He kept watch for 4 hours. During those 4 hours, not a single sound came from behind the door. No footsteps, no sound of whiskey being poured, nothing at all. Perry Shaw had followed Knox Mercer for 14 years, through nights ordinary men wouldn't have survived, and he had never feared Knox the way he feared those 4 hours of silence. Because Perry knew Knox Mercer in anger was dangerous, Knox Mercer cold was deadly, but Knox Mercer completely silent meant that something inside him had just changed in a way that could never be undone. When the door opened at midnight, Knox stepped out with a face so calm it was frightening. He looked at Perry and said, "I need Colton here tomorrow morning at 7. Then he turned back into the room. Perry didn't ask why. That night, Knox Mercer sat at his desk and wrote 3 letters. The first letter was for Colton Price, with detailed instructions for establishing an anonymous trust, the money to be transferred from Knox's legal assets through 4 layers of legal entities, so no one could trace it back to the source. and the sole beneficiary was Felicity Davenport. The trust would activate if Knox was arrested, convicted, or died, and it would make sure Felicity never had to work 3 jobs at once or sleep 4 hours a night just to survive again. She wouldn't know where the money came from. She would never know. The second letter was for Perry Shaw, shorter but heavier. It contained a list, the names of every man in the East Coast underworld with enough power and enough reason to threaten a federal prosecutor if they learned she was related to Knox Mercer by blood. The list was 11 names long. Beneath the list, Knox wrote only one line: "Protect her at any cost, even if you have to protect her from me." Perry would receive that letter the next morning, and he would understand that this wasn't an order from a crime boss to a subordinate. It was a plea from an older brother to the only man he trusted. The third letter took Knox the longest to write. He wrote it to Felicity. He told her about the day she was taken, about the pink bracelet on the sidewalk, about their mother screaming beneath the spinning police lights, about their mother dying 2 years later with her daughter's photograph in her hand, about their father spending the rest of his life searching for her and dying at his desk among stacks of missing children's files. He told her he had opened the tin box every night for 25 years and looked at her pink plastic bracelet. He told her he wasn't a good man, that he had done things she, as a prosecutor, had every right and every reason to convict him for. And he told her that if there was one thing in his life he didn't regret, it was that he had never stopped looking for her. He wrote 3 pages. Then he folded the letter carefully, each crease perfectly straight, and he didn't send it. He opened the bottom drawer, took out the tin box, and placed the letter inside beside the pink plastic bracelet, the lock of baby hair, and the scribbled drawing that didn't form any words. Then he closed the tin box and shut the drawer. The letter would stay there until Knox found the right moment, or until he no longer had any chance left. The next morning, Colton Price arrived at the mansion at exactly 7 o'clock, as requested. Knox gave him the first letter, briefly explained the trust, and Colton, though he was a lawyer, accustomed to strange requests from Knox, still frowned. An anonymous trust for the prosecutor who's trying to put you away. Knox didn't explain. He only added one thing: the federal case, don't delay it anymore. Let her take it forward. Colton looked at him as if he were looking at a man who had lost his mind. Are you insane? She'll bury you. Knox looked out the window, where the early light was laying silver across the surface of Long Island Sound, and answered in the softest voice Perry had ever heard him use. If she's good enough to bury me, then she's truly a Mercer. In the weeks that followed, Felicity Davenport began to realize something wasn't right with her case. Not wrong in a bad way, but wrong in a way that was too good. And for someone who had grown up in the foster system, where no one gave anyone anything for free, too good always meant there's a trap. First came the witness, a former chief accountant for Mercer Holdings, named Gerald Fenn, whom the file said had disappeared from New York 3 years earlier, suddenly contacted the SDNY office and voluntarily offered testimony. No demand for witness protection, no demand for immunity, just a simple call saying, "I'm willing to cooperate." Then came the documents. Internal records from 3 shell companies that Felicity had spent 2 months trying to subpoena suddenly appeared in her office mailbox. Complete notarized copies. No sender, no attached letter. Next came a bank account in Delaware she hadn't even known existed, suddenly frozen by the bank for suspicious activity, and the bank proactively notified SDNY instead of the other way around. Felicity sat in Gould's office, placed the 3 sets of documents on his desk, and spoke plainly. Knox Mercer has run this empire for more than 10 years without exposing a single weakness the FBI, the IRS, or any agency could touch. And now, suddenly, everything just falls into our hands. Doesn't that strike you as strange? Gould leaned back in his chair, his hands laced behind his head, smiling the kind of smile worn by a man on the verge of a promotion. Sometimes we win because we're good, Davenport. Don't sabotage your own case. Felicity didn't argue further, because she knew Gould didn't want to hear it. He wanted a conviction. An election year was coming, and Knox Mercer on the evening news was the kind of victory Gould had been waiting for his entire career. But Felicity wasn't Gould. She didn't chase victory. She chased the truth, and the truth was telling her that someone inside the Mercer organization was deliberately opening doors for her to walk through. She just didn't know why. While Felicity was trying to understand why the case had become too easy, Knox Mercer was quietly taking care of her from a distance in ways she couldn't recognize. He knew where she lived, which floor, what kind of lock was on her door, and exactly how it was broken. A week after receiving the DNA results, a repairman knocked on the door of Felicity's fifth-floor apartment in Brooklyn, introduced himself as a building maintenance worker, and said management was upgrading the locks on every floor. Felicity didn't suspect anything because her old lock really had been broken for a long time, and she had filed 3 complaints without anyone answering. The repairman replaced the lock in 20 minutes and left. She didn't know he had been paid 5 times the usual rate and had taken his orders directly from Perry Shaw. Next came the food. An Italian restaurant in Cobble Hill began delivering free dinners to her apartment 3 times a week, with a flyer saying, "Trial program for new residents in the area." Felicity called the restaurant to confirm and was told that yes, it was a promotional program. She didn't know the restaurant belonged to a chain in which Mercer Holdings owned a 30% stake, and that the new resident program had exactly 1 resident on its list. Then came the dehumidifier. Felicity had suffered from mild asthma since childhood, and her 5th-floor apartment was so damp that black mold had grown on the bathroom wall. One day, she came home and found a new dehumidifier placed outside her door, still in the box, with a receipt that read, "From building management, sorry for the inconvenience." She called management, and the person on duty said, "Oh yes, we sent it. Sorry for the delay." She didn't know management actually knew nothing about the dehumidifier until they received a call from an unknown number telling them to take responsibility if anyone asked. All of it, the new lock, the food, the dehumidifier, came from Knox Mercer, but not in the way a mafia boss controlled a target. This was how an older brother cared for his little sister from far away when he couldn't knock on her door and say, "It's me, your brother." During that same time, Felicity began surveilling Knox as part of building her case. She sat in a rental car parked 300 meters from the Connecticut mansion, watched through binoculars, and took notes on the schedule of people coming and going. Most of what she saw was what she expected: black cars, men in suits, closed-door meetings. But one Sunday afternoon, she looked through the binoculars and saw a scene that made her lower them, then raise them again because she couldn't believe her eyes. Knox Mercer was sitting on the back steps of the house, his legs stretched out, and on his lap sat a little girl about 3 years old, with curly brown hair and a floral dress. He was reading to the child from a hardcover book with large illustrations, though Felicity couldn't make out the title. The little girl held a box of crayons and was drawing on his face, a blue streak across his forehead, a red streak on his cheek, and Knox didn't wipe it away, didn't move the child's hand aside, didn't frown. He simply kept reading, his voice carrying across the yard, just enough for Felicity to hear the rhythm but not the words, and now and then he stopped so the little girl could turn the page because she liked doing it herself. But it wasn't just Knox's softness that shattered her defense. It was the realization of who the girl was. Through her deep investigation into the Mercer organization's recent activities, Felicity knew this toddler was Maeve, an innocent orphan Knox had personally rescued months ago when he ruthlessly dismantled one of Warren Hale's human trafficking rings. Knox had taken the nameless, traumatized child into his own home, protecting her from the underworld and raising her with a tenderness she never thought a mafia boss possessed. Watching the most feared man on the eastern seaboard patiently guide the little girl's hand filled Felicity with a profound confusion, cracking the cold, unyielding image she had built of him. She drove back to Brooklyn in silence, her head turning over a question she didn't want to ask. What kind of man was Knox Mercer when no one was watching? She got home, climbed 5 flights of stairs, and found a small package outside her door. Inside was a box of ginger tea, the kind she drank every morning, the kind she hadn't told anyone about because it wasn't the sort of information people shared. No letter, no name, nothing at all except the box of tea. Felicity stood on the threshold, holding the box in her hands, and for the first time in 25 years of living alone, she felt something stranger than fear and more uncomfortable than suspicion. The feeling that someone out there was seeing her, not seeing the prosecutor, not seeing Jane Doe number 7742, but seeing her, the woman who drank ginger tea every morning in her small kitchen, and that person wanted her to know she was seen. The box of ginger tea changed everything, not because it was frightening, but because it was too precise. Someone knew she drank ginger tea every morning, and that wasn't the kind of information contained in any file. Felicity set the box of tea on the kitchen table and sat staring at it for 30 minutes, not because she was afraid, but because her mind was assembling the pieces she had previously ignored. The case was too easy. The witness came on his own. The documents fell into her hands on their own. The door lock was fixed without her asking. Free food was delivered. The dehumidifier. And now, the box of ginger tea. All of those things weren't threats. They were care. And care from an unknown source toward someone who had grown up without anyone caring for her was more suspicious than any threat. Felicity stopped investigating Knox Mercer. She started investigating herself. She began with the only thing she had about her past, her adoption records. She had tried to access this file 3 times in her life. The first time when she was 18, the second when she was 22, and the third when she joined the SDNY. All 3 times, she had been denied. The file was sealed, but this time, with the access of a federal prosecutor, she checked the reason for the sealing and found something she had never noticed before. Her file hadn't been sealed by a New Jersey state court as usual, but by a federal order. That was the level of sealing reserved for national security cases or witness protection, not for an ordinary orphaned child found at a bus station. Why would the adoption records of a Jane Doe be sealed at the federal level? That question burned through her all that night and the next day, and on Saturday morning, she drove 4 hours from Brooklyn up to Vermont to see the only person who might have an answer. Mrs. Ruth Davenport was sitting on the porch, picking weeds out of a basket of green beans when Felicity parked in front of the gate. She didn't ask why Felicity had come without calling first. She simply stood, hugged her, and said, "Come in and have lunch, child." They ate bean soup and cornbread in the kitchen, and Felicity waited until Mrs. Ruth had finished pouring the tea before asking, "Mama, I need to see my adoption papers. Everything you have." Mrs. Ruth looked at her for a long while. She didn't ask why, because she was the kind of person who understood there were questions people only asked when they were ready to hear the answer. She stood, went into the bedroom, and came back with an old shoebox tied with a rubber band. Inside was everything the system had given her when she took Felicity in 15 years earlier. The official adoption papers, the transfer of guardianship from the state of New Jersey, a copy of the amended birth certificate issued when Felicity was 10, and a thin sheet of paper listing the information for the intermediary agency that had handled the adoption. Felicity looked at the intermediary sheet first. The agency listed was a law firm named Hargrove and Stearns, with an address in Newark. She had never heard that name, but something tightened low in her stomach when she read the Newark address, the same city where she had been found at 4 years old, the same city where Warren Hale had an office. She took out her phone and searched quickly. Hargrove and Stearns had dissolved in 2003. 4 years after she was placed into the system. No website, no active business record. Only one business registration line with the state of New Jersey under the founder's name, Lloyd Hargrove. She searched Lloyd Hargrove, and the first result made her set the phone down on the table very slowly. Lloyd Hargrove had once represented Warren Hale in a civil lawsuit in 2001. The law firm that handled her adoption had a direct connection to Warren Hale. Felicity's hands were slightly cold as she picked up the amended birth certificate. This was the version issued when she was 10, and most of the information on it was new. The name Felicity, the surname of her foster family at the time, the estimated date of birth. But in the upper right corner, there was a section she had never examined closely because it had been blacked out with thick black ink, the section labeled Original Name. Someone had tried to erase this information, and they had erased it carefully enough that under normal light, only a long black streak could be seen. But Felicity was a prosecutor, and she knew ink on old paper reacted differently under different light sources. She turned on her phone's flash, held it close to the paper, and tilted the page until the light ran sideways across the layer of ink, and beneath the black streak, faint but readable, were 3 capital letters before the ink swallowed the rest. R-O-S, Rose, 3 letters. Not enough to make a full name, but enough for Felicity to feel the ground shift under her feet. She hugged Mrs. Ruth goodbye, drove 4 hours back to New York in silence, and went straight to her Brooklyn apartment. She opened her computer, accessed the NCIC system, the National Missing Children database, and entered the search filters. Female. 4 years old. 1999. New Jersey. Name beginning with Rose. The system returned 3 results. The first result was a girl in Trenton found after 2 weeks. The third was a family abduction. The girl returned to her mother. The second result was Rosalind Mercer, 4 years old, missing on October 12, 1999, in Newark, New Jersey, daughter of Patrick Mercer and Catherine Mercer, sister of Knox Mercer. The file status read still open. Not found. Felicity stared at the screen. Then she turned her head and looked at the surveillance photograph of Knox Mercer taped to the wall across from her bed. The face with the sharp jaw, gray eyes, and controlled expression. Then she stood, walked into the bathroom, and looked in the mirror. She looked at her own jawline, her own eyes, the way her hair parted on the left exactly like the man in the photograph on the wall. She looked at her left hand, tracing that familiar, nervous clench and unconscious genetic inheritance from a mother she never got to know. And Felicity Davenport, the woman who had built her entire life on the principle of never letting emotion control judgment, stood in the small bathroom of her fifth-floor Brooklyn apartment and understood that the man she was trying to put in prison might be her own blood brother. Felicity didn't sleep that night. She sat on the bed, looking at Knox Mercer's photograph on the wall and at her own face reflected on the dark computer screen. Two faces in the same room, the same jawline, the same gray eyes, and she couldn't deny what her reason was, screaming at her. She needed confirmation. Not from the NCIC file, not from the 3 faint letters on the birth certificate, but by looking into that man's eyes and asking him directly. The next morning, at 7 o'clock, Felicity drove from Brooklyn to Connecticut. She didn't bring a court order, didn't bring any files, didn't bring a recorder or anything that belonged to Felicity Davenport, the prosecutor. She only brought herself, and that was the most frightening thing she had ever carried anywhere. The Mercer mansion sat on a gentle hill overlooking Long Island Sound, with gray stone walls, black iron gates, and a white gravel drive. She parked outside the gate, rang the bell, and when the security camera turned toward her, she looked straight into the lens without saying a word. The gate opened after 40 seconds. She drove in, parked in front of the main entrance, and stepped onto the porch. The door opened before she could knock. The woman who opened it was Martha Finch, whom everyone in the house called Marnie, the Mercer family housekeeper since Patrick was still alive. She was 64 years old, her white silver hair pinned neatly in a bun, her back straight, a silver tea tray in her hands, because she was bringing morning tea up to Knox's study as she did every day. Marnie looked at Felicity, and the tea tray fell, not because she was afraid, not because she was startled to see a stranger, but because she saw a face, Catherine Mercer's face, the face of her former mistress, the woman Marnie had cared for until the day she died in a bed at St. Barnabas Hospital. And that face was looking back at her from a 29-year-old woman standing on the porch in the morning light. The silver tray hit the ground with a crash. The teacup shattered. Hot water spread across the stone. Marnie lifted a hand to cover her mouth, and the old woman's eyes filled with tears in a single second. Lord God, oh my Lord. Felicity didn't understand that reaction. Not yet, but she felt it in a place deeper than reason. Felt that this woman was seeing something in her that she herself couldn't see. Knox appeared at the end of the hallway within 30 seconds, surely because of the sound of the tray falling. He stepped into the living room, wearing a white shirt with the buttons not fully fastened, his sleeves rolled up. And when he saw Felicity standing in the doorway with Marnie crying beside her, he stopped. Not just stopped walking, but stopped completely, the kind of stopping where the whole body ceased moving at once, even the breath. The two of them looked at each other. No one said anything for 1 full minute. 60 seconds that Felicity counted one by one in her head because she didn't know what else to do. Knox looked at her in a way no one had ever looked at her before. Not the look of a defendant in a courtroom, not the observing look from the elevator hallway, but the look of a man seeing the thing he had searched for all his life and not daring to believe it was real. Felicity spoke first. You knew. Her voice was flat, controlled, but smaller than usual. You knew. Knox swallowed hard. Since 3 weeks ago. Silence. Then Felicity went on, and this time her voice was no longer flat. How long have you been looking for me? Knox looked at her for 1 more second, then said, Come with me. He led her into the study. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, took out the tin box, placed it on the desktop between them, and opened the lid. Inside was the pink plastic bracelet, a lock of baby hair tied with a white thread, and a scribbled drawing on a yellowed piece of paper. Shapeless lines made by a 4-year-old child. Knox said nothing. He let the object speak for him. Felicity looked at the bracelet, and something happened that she couldn't control. Something that wasn't memory, because she remembered nothing from when she was 4, but deeper than memory, down in the bones, in the way her fingers rose and touched the pink plastic bracelet, as if her hand knew the object before her mind could understand. She touched the worn plastic surface, and tears fell before she allowed them to fall, before she could decide whether she should cry or not, before the wall she had built for 25 years could stop them. The tears kept falling, and she hated them, hated their weakness, hated that she was crying in front of the Mafia boss she was prosecuting. But she couldn't stop. Then she stepped back. 1 step, 2 steps, enough distance for the wall to rise again. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and when she looked up, her eyes were once again the eyes of Felicity Davenport, the prosecutor. "You're a Mafia boss. I'm a federal prosecutor. You run an empire I've spent 6 months building evidence to destroy, and now you give me a plastic bracelet and tell me we're family. Which truth am I supposed to choose?" Knox didn't step back with her. He didn't move closer. He stood still beside the desk, the tin box still open, and spoke in the gentlest voice he had. "You don't have to choose tonight." Felicity looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then she turned, walked through the hallway where Marnie had already cleaned up the broken tea tray but was still standing there with red eyes, and she stepped out the door, down the porch steps, into her car, and drove away. She drove 2 hours back to Brooklyn without turning on the radio, without calling anyone, without stopping. When she opened the door to her 5th-floor apartment, she saw the dehumidifier in the corner of the bathroom, the box of ginger tea on the kitchen shelf, and the bag of fruit in the refrigerator that she hadn't bought. She stood in the middle of the small apartment, looking at those things, and now she understood. The new lock, the food, the dehumidifier, the ginger tea. Not a stalker. Not a tactic. It was her brother. It was the way a man who wasn't allowed to knock on his sister's door had tried to care for her from the other side of a wall. Neither of them knew how to break. On Monday morning, Felicity Davenport walked into the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York at 7:15, half an hour earlier than everyone else, sat down at her desk, opened the Knox Mercer file, and kept working as though the weekend had never happened. She drafted a list of questions for the next witness. She wrote the summary of new evidence for Gould. She called the FBI to confirm the coordination schedule. Every call, every sheet of paper, every line of email was precise, professional, and sharp, as though she hadn't stood in Knox Mercer's study 2 days earlier and cried over a pink plastic bracelet. But when the office was empty and no one was watching, Felicity sat still, looking down at her left hand, her thumb pressing into her palm, and she hated herself for having cried. She had spent 25 years building herself into someone who didn't cry. She had lived through 6 foster families, a group home, hungry nights, days when no one remembered her birthday, and she hadn't cried. She had driven through the snowy night from Vermont to New York to begin law school with $300 in her account, and she hadn't cried. But she touched one cheap plastic bracelet and completely broke down, a sudden vulnerability that made her angrier than anything Knox Mercer could ever do to her. Because it meant that somewhere inside her, in a place 25 years of self-protection hadn't reached, there was still a 4-year-old child trying to find her way home, and Felicity didn't know what to do with that child. She didn't know where to place the information "I have a brother" inside her chest. For 25 years, she had lived with the belief that she had no one, that she was Jane Doe, that her biological family was either dead or had abandoned her, and that belief hurt, but it was stable. It was the foundation she had used to build everything else. Now someone was telling her that foundation was wrong, that she hadn't been abandoned, that someone had searched for her every day for 25 years, and instead of relief, she felt as if the ground were cracking beneath her feet, because if she wasn't Jane Doe, if she was Rosalind Mercer, then who was she? Who had she been for 25 years? On Wednesday night, Felicity called Mrs. Ruth. She didn't say anything about Knox, about the records, about the bracelet. She only lay in bed in her Brooklyn apartment, staring at the ceiling, and asked a question she had never asked before. "Mama, did you ever think I had a biological family out there?" The line went silent for a long while. Then Mrs. Ruth spoke in a slow, careful voice, the voice of someone who had been waiting for this question for a very long time. "Mama always knew you had someone out there, my girl." Felicity closed her eyes. "Why did you think that, Mama?" "Because you cried in your sleep, Felicity. For the first 10 years, every night, you cried and called a name Mama didn't teach you. Mama thought maybe it was an imaginary friend. Mama asked you once and you said you didn't remember. But Mama knew it wasn't an imaginary friend, because imaginary friends don't make children cry like that." Felicity opened her eyes. Her heartbeat slowed in a way she recognized as her body preparing for shock. What name, Mama? Mrs. Ruth hesitated for 1 second. You called for Knox. N-O-X. Mama looked it up in the dictionary. It didn't mean anything. Mama thought maybe it was an abbreviation, or a nickname, or something from before you came to me. Felicity let the phone fall onto the pillow. It lay there, Mrs. Ruth's voice still coming through, asking, Baby, are you still there? But Felicity wasn't listening. She was hearing something else. The echo of a 4-year-old child trying to pronounce her brother's name when her tongue wasn't yet old enough to say it right. Knox. Knox. That child had called his name in her sleep for 10 years. That child hadn't forgotten. That child's body had remembered what her mind had been robbed of. And she had cried every night because she couldn't find her way back to the person she was calling for. Felicity lay still on the bed, tears soaking into the pillow, and this time she didn't hate herself for crying. This time, she cried for the 4-year-old child who had cried alone for 10 years while no one understood why. In Connecticut, Knox Mercer knew Felicity was still prosecuting him. Perry reported every day. She still went to the office, still prepared the files, still called witnesses. Knox nodded and said nothing. Perry stood in the doorway of the study, his arms crossed over his chest, and finally couldn't stand it anymore. You're letting her bury you. You know that, don't you? She has everything she needs. Knox didn't look up. I know. Then why aren't you doing anything? Because she was robbed of 25 years of choice, Perry. 25 years of not knowing who she was, not knowing she had a family, not knowing someone was looking for her. I won't take another choice away from her. If she chooses to prosecute me, that's her right. Perry looked at him longer than usual, then shook his head and walked out. In the hallway, he nearly ran into Marnie. The old woman stood there with a Polaroid photograph in her hand, yellowed with age, showing a little girl with auburn hair sitting on the shoulders of a 12-year-old boy, both of them laughing, with the front yard of the old house in Newark behind them. Marnie stepped past Perry into Knox's study, placed the photograph on the desk right in front of him, and spoke in a voice only someone who had once changed his diapers would dare to use. You look at this picture, Knox. That's you and your sister. You're giving that girl the right to choose, and that's the right thing. But you've forgotten that she's also giving you a choice. Knox looked at the photograph. Marnie looked at him. Do you want to be her brother? Or do you want to be the defendant? Because you can't be both forever. She turned and walked out, closing the door behind her. And Knox Mercer sat alone in his study, looking at the Polaroid, looking at the smile of the 12-year-old boy carrying his little sister, and he wondered when the last time was that he had smiled like that. While Knox was being torn between being a brother and being a defendant, someone else had already chosen his role long ago. Bo Mercer, 34 years old. Knox's cousin, the son of Uncle Thomas, had grown up inside the Mercer mansion like a shadow beside an oil portrait. Bo managed the legal side of the empire, the restaurant chain, the real estate company, the clean investment fund, the things Knox handed to him because they needed a face that knew how to smile in front of the camera. And Bo was very good at smiling. But Bo understood his place clearly. He was the front, not the foundation. And every time Knox made a decision without asking him, every time Perry Shaw walked into a meeting room while Bo was asked to leave, every time someone in the organization called him the Mercer kid behind his back, the resentment inside Bo thickened by another layer. Bo didn't hate Knox the way an enemy hated him. He hated Knox the way a cousin hated him, the kind of hatred mixed with admiration and jealousy, and the feeling that he would never be good enough no matter how hard he tried. And when the federal case exploded, Bo saw an opportunity. He contacted Nelson Gould, not through Felicity, not through any official channel, but through a meeting at a bar in Midtown at 10 o'clock at night, 2 men sitting in a hidden corner, one wanting to bring down his cousin, and the other wanting the biggest conviction of his career in the very year of an election. The agreement was simple. Bo would provide inside information, documents, schedules, weaknesses in Knox's system, and in return, Gould would guarantee Bo wouldn't be prosecuted when the empire collapsed, and more importantly, Bo would be the one to take over the legal side after Knox went to prison. Gould didn't tell Felicity because Gould knew she wouldn't accept evidence from a source with a self-serving motive. Felicity was the kind of prosecutor who built a case with bricks, one brick at a time, and she would throw back any brick that had a crack in it. Gould didn't care whether the bricks were cracked or not. He only needed the wall to stand long enough for a photograph before it fell. Evidence began appearing in the case file that Felicity hadn't requested. An internal asset statement for Mercer Holdings, detailed enough that only an insider could have had it. A list of bank accounts she had never known existed. Minutes from internal meetings bearing Knox's signature. Felicity read each page and felt the familiar sensation that had followed her from the beginning of the case. Too easy. She checked the source. Gould said it was anonymous. She didn't accept that answer. She traced the way the documents had been sent. The envelopes, the printing paper, the file format, and after 2 days, she narrowed it down to a very small group of people who had access to those materials. All of them belonged to the legal division. All of them reported to Bo Mercer. She walked into Gould's office, closed the door, and spoke plainly. This evidence came from Bo Mercer. You know that. Gould leaned back in his chair, not flustered, not denying it. A prosecutor doesn't need to know the source, Davenport. You need a conviction. Evidence from a source with a self-serving motive is dirty evidence. Any judge would throw it out. Gould looked at her, and the smile on his face changed into something smoother, colder. Not our judge. Felicity stood still. That sentence had only one meaning. Judge Catherine Briggs, who was overseeing the Knox-Mercer case, had been arranged. The case wasn't clean. It wasn't only dirty evidence. The entire system handling it was dirty too. And Felicity Davenport, the woman who had spent her whole life fighting to stand on the clean side of the line, was realizing she had been placed in the middle of a game where she wasn't a player, but a piece on the board. She walked out of Gould's office without another word. On the other side, Knox knew about Bo before Felicity did. Perry had discovered Bo's meeting with Gould 3 weeks earlier through the camera of a hotel Mercer Holdings owned near the bar in Midtown. Knox watched the footage, saw his cousin shaking hands with the head prosecutor, and he didn't get angry. He went silent, the kind of silence Perry had learned to fear, the kind of silence before a storm with no wind. Knox handled Bo in one night. No gunshots, no blood, no threatening calls. He called the chief accountant at 10 o'clock at night and ordered him to revoke all of Bo's financial access, freeze the operating accounts, transfer every loyal employee out of Bo's control, and withdraw Bo's authorized signature from every contract. At 6 o'clock the next morning, Bo Mercer woke up in the Manhattan penthouse Knox had bought for him, opened his phone, and discovered that he was still rich, but had nothing left. No employee took orders from him. No account could be accessed by him. No one called back. He still had money in his personal account, still had the penthouse, still had the car, but he was no longer a Mercer. He was only a rich man living inside an empty shell, and that emptiness was crueler than any bullet. Bo called Knox. Knox didn't answer. Bo called Perry. Perry said only one sentence. He told me to tell you that you should leave New York. Then he hung up. Bo didn't leave New York. Instead, in the desperation and fury of a man who had just lost everything, he played his final move. He contacted what remained of the Hale organization, the men who had once been loyal to Warren before Knox crushed that empire, the men waiting for any chance at revenge, and Bo gave them the thing they wanted most, Knox Mercer's weakness. Knox Mercer had a biological sister. Her name was Felicity Davenport. She was the federal prosecutor trying him, and she had no one protecting her. Less than 48 hours after Bo made his move, Felicity began to realize something was wrong. The first night, she came home late from the SDNY office, close to 11 o'clock, and saw a black sedan parked across the street, facing the entrance to her building. Lights off, engine running. She registered it in her mind but didn't think much of it because this was Brooklyn, and cars sitting overnight weren't exactly rare. The second night, the sedan came back, same spot, same hour, and this time Felicity noticed the license plate was different from the night before. 2 different cars, same model, same position. She began paying attention. The third night, there was no sedan, but as she walked home from the subway station, she felt eyes on her. The kind of sensation children who grew up in group homes learned by instinct, because failing to feel it meant you weren't safe. She turned quickly and saw a figure slip into an alley, too fast for her to see the face clearly, but slow enough for her to know it wasn't just an ordinary passerby. The next morning, when she opened her apartment door to go to work, a white envelope was lying on the doormat. No stamp, no address. Someone had placed it there by hand during the night. She picked it up, opened it, and inside were 3 photographs of her taken from a distance. One at the building entrance, one at the subway station, and one through the window of her 5th-floor apartment, taken from the building across the street. Beneath the last photograph, written in neat capital letters with a black pen, were 4 words: Mercer blood. Interesting. Felicity stood on the threshold, holding the 3 photographs, and for the first time since becoming a prosecutor, she felt afraid. Not a vague fear, but a specific one. The fear of someone who knew that somebody had stood there watching her sleep through a window and she hadn't known. She stepped back inside, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. She could call the police. She could call the FBI. She could call Gould. But the police would file a report and forget. The FBI would take 2 weeks to process it. And Gould, she no longer trusted. She looked at her phone. Then she did something she herself couldn't believe she was doing. She called Knox Mercer. His phone number was in the case file, the official contact number through his attorney, but Felicity had memorized it long ago because that was her job, knowing everything about the target of her prosecution. The phone rang twice. Knox answered. His voice was completely awake, even though it was only near 6 o'clock in the morning, and Felicity wondered whether he ever slept. "I'm being followed. 3 nights. Someone took pictures of me and left an envelope at my door. They know I'm a Mercer." Half a second of silence. Then Knox spoke, and his voice changed in a way Felicity had never heard before. It wasn't colder. It was deeper, as if everything unimportant had been pushed aside and only one thing remained. Felicity. 20 minutes. She realized it was the first time he had called her by her name. Not Miss Davenport, not my sister, just Felicity, and she didn't correct him. She said nothing more. He hung up. Exactly 20 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Felicity opened it, and Knox stood there, Perry behind him, both dressed in dark clothes. And Knox looked at her first, then past her shoulder into the apartment. She watched his eyes sweep across the room, the small dining table piled with files and doubling as a work desk, the kitchen with only enough space for one person to stand, the bedroom window without curtains because she had never bought any, and the new lock he had sent someone to install now pried loose. Someone had broken it to place the envelope there without needing to enter, only to prove they could. Knox's jaw tightened, not the kind of tightening that came with anger, but the kind that came when someone was forcing everything inside him down deep enough not to explode in front of another person. He looked at the small, damp, poorly lit apartment where his sister had lived for so long, and Felicity saw in his eyes not judgment, but pain, the kind of pain that belonged to a man realizing he had searched for 25 years, while she had been living 2 hours away in a room whose window didn't even have curtains. "The little girl I rescued from Hale's shadow is safe at my house, Felicity. You're coming with me, until I finish dealing with this." Hearing his fierce devotion to protecting those left vulnerable by the underworld, Felicity didn't answer for 5 seconds, her prosecutorial armor melting into a deep, human exhaustion. Then she turned back inside, grabbed a bag of clothes that took her exactly 4 minutes to pack because she didn't own much, and stepped out the door. On the drive back to Connecticut, Perry drove, Knox sat in the passenger seat, and Felicity sat in the back. And on the back seat beside her, strapped into a child safety seat, was baby Maeve, the 3-year-old little girl with curly brown hair whom Marnie had brought along because the child had cried and refused to stay home when Knox was gone. Maeve slept for the first 10 minutes. Then the car passed over a pothole, and the little girl startled but didn't fully wake. Her head tilted over and rested against Felicity's shoulder. Felicity went rigid. She wasn't used to children. She had never held a child, never had any child lean against her with such trust, because children only leaned into people they felt safe with, and Felicity had never been anyone's safe place. Maeve breathed evenly, her warmth passing through Felicity's coat, her soft brown curls brushing Felicity's neck. Then, very slowly, so slowly, it was as if she were afraid the child would break if she touched too quickly. Felicity placed her hand on Maeve's hair. She didn't stroke it. She simply rested her hand there, lightly, as though she were learning how to touch something she had never been allowed to touch before. Knox looked through the rearview mirror. He saw his sister sitting in his car, her hand resting on the hair of the child he was raising, and something inside his chest, something that had first stirred when he saw her name in the adoption file, no longer merely stirred, it beat. For the first time in 25 years, it truly beat. Felicity stayed at the Mercer mansion for 2 weeks, and she refused to call it home. She called it temporary lodging for security reasons, when speaking to herself inside her own head. Because giving it any other name would mean admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. She worked from the living room, her laptop set on the coffee table, her phone tucked between her shoulder and ear, files spread across the floor, And every morning she called the SDNY as if she were sitting at her desk on the 14th floor, instead of in the living room of the Mafia boss she was prosecuting. She kept the case moving. She drafted documents, called witnesses, wrote presentations, and no one at the office knew where she was beyond the fact that she was working remotely for personal reasons. But the Mercer mansion wasn't the studio apartment in Brooklyn. It didn't let her hide inside work and forget everything around her. It constantly reminded her of the man who owned it, and that man constantly reminded her of the things she was trying not to look at directly. Small details gathered day by day. On the second day, she went to get water in the kitchen and saw, on the corner of Knox's desk, lying beside a stack of papers, the yellowed Polaroid photograph Marnie had given him, the auburn-haired little girl sitting on the shoulders of a 12-year-old boy, both of them laughing, the front yard of the house in Newark behind them. Felicity stood looking at the photograph for 30 seconds. Now she knew that child was her, and that boy was Knox. And the smile on the boy's face was so wide it filled the whole frame, the kind of smile she had never once seen on the face of 37-year-old Knox Mercer. On the fourth day, she sat working in the living room and heard Knox speaking on the phone in the room next door. His voice was cold, even, and carried the weight of steel, the kind of voice that gave orders without needing to rise. And she heard him say one sentence that made the person on the other end fall completely silent before hanging up. 5 minutes later, she looked out the window and saw Knox sitting on the playroom floor, legs stretched out, his back against the sofa, with Maeve sitting between his knees, the two of them working on a puzzle. Knox patiently placed each piece, and when Maeve put one in the wrong spot, he didn't correct her. He waited until she realized it herself, and turned the piece around on her own. Then he clapped and said, "Well done." And Maeve laughed. The distance between Knox on the phone and Knox on the floor was only 5 minutes. But they were two entirely different men. And Felicity didn't know which one was real, or maybe both of them were real, and that was the part that kept her awake. On the 7th day, she found the archive. Not a decorative reading room, but a room in the basement, locked with a passcode, which she accidentally saw Knox open when he didn't know she was standing at the top of the stairs. She waited until he left, then went down, entered the code she had memorized, and stepped inside. The room was about 20 square meters wide, with iron shelves along the walls, and on those shelves were hundreds of file boxes. Each box was labeled by year and region: 2000, New England; 2003, Midwest; 2007, West Coast. 25 years of searching, hundreds of leads, hundreds of false trails, hundreds of missing children. Knox had checked one by one to see whether any of them was Rosalind. Felicity walked along the shelves, her hand skimming over the labels on the boxes, and felt the weight of 25 years pressing down on her chest. The last box, in the lower right corner, was labeled differently from the others. No year, no region, only one word: possible. She opened it. Inside were photographs of herself. A high school yearbook photo, a college graduation photo, a photo from her SDNY swearing-in ceremony clipped from a local news report, a photo of her walking on a Brooklyn street, taken from a distance. Knox had found her before opening Warren Hale's safe. He just hadn't been sure. He had collected her photographs, had followed her, had placed them inside a file box labeled possible, because he didn't dare write "this is her" until the DNA confirmed it. Felicity closed the file box, turned off the light, went upstairs, and didn't tell Knox she had entered the archive. But the next morning, breakfast changed. Before that, every morning Knox and Felicity had sat across from each other in the dining room, he reading the newspaper, she reading the case files, Marnie placing toast and coffee in the middle of the table, and no one saying anything. That silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy, the kind of silence between two people who had too much to say, and neither knew where to begin. On the morning of the 9th day, Felicity sat down at the table, looked at the plate of toast, and spoke without looking up. "I called you Knox when I was 4. Knox was turning a page of the newspaper. His hand stopped. He lowered the paper to the table, very slowly, and looked at her. His eyes, those gray eyes Felicity had learned to read over the past 2 weeks, trembled, only for a second, so briefly that she would have missed it if she had blinked. But she didn't blink. She looked at him and he looked at her, and in that second, there was no Mafia, no courtroom, no case or file, only two people looking at each other across 25 years of loss. She went on, still not looking up. "Mama Ruth told me I cried in my sleep calling for Knox for 10 years. I didn't know who that was. Now I know. Knox placed both hands on the table, fingers laced together, and Felicity saw his knuckles turn white because he was gripping them tight to hold himself steady. He said, his voice breaking on the third word before he corrected it. I carried you on my shoulders every morning. You pulled my ears and laughed. You made me run around the yard and shout, faster, faster, and I ran until I fell, and then you laughed even louder. Felicity looked down at the plate of toast. She didn't eat. He didn't eat either. Marnie stood in the kitchen doorway, her back turned, wiping her hands on her apron, and her shoulders shook softly. No one said anything more. They sat there in silence. But this wasn't the heavy silence of the days before. This was the silence of two people who had just said the most important thing and needed no more words. That night, after putting Maeve to bed, Knox went into his study. And on the corner of the desk, in the exact place where the Polaroid photograph still lay, there was a cup of ginger tea. Still hot, steam rose gently in the lamplight. Felicity had made it for him. She didn't say anything, didn't leave a note, didn't appear in the doorway to explain. She had simply made a cup of tea and placed it there, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, as if she had done this all her life. Knox sat down in the chair. He looked at the cup of tea. He didn't drink it. He sat there looking at the cup of ginger tea until the steam stopped rising and the surface of the tea lay still, until it had gone completely cold, because he didn't want to drink it. He wanted to remember that it was there. For 25 years, he had opened the tin box every night and looked at the pink plastic bracelet to remember that his little sister had once existed. Now, there was a cup of ginger tea on his desk, and it meant his sister didn't merely exist. She was in the room next door, and she had just made tea for him. Knox Mercer sat in his study, looking at the cold cup of tea, and for the first time in 25 years, he didn't need to open the tin box before going to sleep. The cup of ginger tea changed something in Felicity, something she didn't admit in words but admitted through action, because the next morning, she no longer sat in the living room reading the Knox Mercer file. She sat there reading the file on Judge Catherine Briggs. Gould had hinted that Briggs had been arraigned, and Felicity was the kind of person who, when she heard a hint, didn't ignore it, but dug until she found the roots. She began with finances. Briggs was the federal judge overseeing the Knox Mercer case, 58 years old, publicly upright, with a clean resume, twice nominated for Judge of the Year by the New York Bar Association. But Felicity had lived long enough inside the system to know that a clean surface often meant someone had cleaned very carefully. She used her federal prosecutor access to examine Briggs's public financial records, asset disclosures, yearly tax filings, real estate transactions. Everything looked normal for a judge, earning $220,000 a year. But when she dug deeper, through the corporate records she had learned to read while building the Mercer case, she found a thread. Briggs had an investment account at a bank in the Cayman Islands, opened 20 years earlier through a trust named Harborview Capital. Felicity looked up Harborview Capital and found a chain of ownership leading through 3 layers of shell companies. And at the final layer, the name of the legal director was Lloyd Hargrove, the same Lloyd Hargrove of Hargrove and Stearns, the law firm that had processed her false adoption records, the same Lloyd Hargrove who had once been Warren Hale's attorney. Briggs's account had received money from a fund directly connected to Warren Hale. Felicity leaned back in her chair and stared at the computer screen, the lines connecting the names appearing in her mind, like the financial chart she had presented before the grand jury. But this time the chart wasn't only about Knox Mercer. It pointed to her. She began putting the entire picture back together from the beginning, and as the pieces locked into place, the image that emerged chilled her from the inside out. Warren Hale hadn't only kidnapped Rosalind Mercer to take revenge on Patrick. He had designed a 25-year game, and every piece had been placed with precision. The first piece was the child. Warren didn't kill Rosalind because he didn't need her dead. He needed her to disappear into the system, to lose her name, lose her roots, so that one day she would grow up into someone else, whom Knox would never find. The second piece was the false adoption file inside the safe. Warren had kept it there not because he was careless, but because he wanted Knox to find it. But only after Warren died, only after Knox had cracked the safe, only when the truth came too late for confrontation. The third piece was Judge Briggs. Warren had bought Briggs 20 years earlier, not for one specific case, but as a long-term investment, a federal judge already in his pocket, ready to be activated when needed. And the fourth piece, the most important piece, was Felicity. Warren knew Felicity was Knox's sister. Maybe he didn't know she would become a prosecutor, but when she entered the SDNY and took the Mercer case, the final piece fell exactly into place. Warren's plan, the plan he had carried with him to his deathbed and wrapped inside his final sentence, was this. Knox would find the file. Knox would know Felicity was his sister. Knox wouldn't fight her because Knox had searched for her for 25 years and would never hurt her. Felicity, knowing nothing, would continue prosecuting him. Briggs, already bought, would make sure the trial ended in a guilty verdict, no matter how weak the evidence was. And Knox Mercer would be sent to prison by his own blood sister, in a rigged trial, while neither of them knew they had been pulled by the strings from the beginning, by an old man dying of cancer with a smile on his lips. I'm going to make you suffer beyond measure, and you'll never know why, until it's too late. Now Felicity knew why. She sat in the living room of the Mercer mansion, staring at the computer screen, and felt something she had never felt in her prosecutorial career. Not anger over dirty evidence, not disappointment in Gould, but the feeling of being used, deep and cold. The feeling that her entire life, from the night she was left at the bus station, to the 6 foster families, to the group home, to law school, to the SDNY, had all taken place on a chessboard she hadn't known she was standing on. She wasn't the prosecutor in this case. She was a weapon, sharpened for 25 years by a dead man, aimed straight at her brother. The chilling realization settled deep into her bones. She wasn't just a victim of a past crime. She had been meticulously sculpted by a ghost to execute his final, twisted vendetta. Warren Hale didn't need to pull any more triggers. He had simply left time and hardship to forge her into the perfect weapon, trusting that her own unyielding drive for justice would eventually slice through her own flesh and blood. Felicity closed the laptop. She stood, walked to the window, looked out at Long Island Sound, where the late afternoon sunlight was laying gold across the water, and spoke aloud, alone, with no one there to hear. I won't let Warren Hale win from the grave. Then she turned back to the table, opened the laptop, and began building a new file. Not a file to prosecute Knox Mercer, but a file to prosecute the corrupt system Warren Hale had planted, starting with Judge Catherine Briggs. It took Felicity 3 days to build a strong enough file on Briggs, and when she was done, she didn't withdraw the Knox Mercer case. She expanded it. On Monday morning, she filed an official motion requesting that the judge assigned to the Mercer case be replaced on the grounds of a financial conflict of interest, attaching evidence of Briggs's Cayman Islands account and the ownership chain leading back to a fund connected to Warren Hale. At the same time, she sent copies of the file to the Federal Judicial Council, the body responsible for overseeing judicial ethics, and requested a formal investigation. She didn't stop at Briggs. She filed a supplemental motion placing Nelson Gould under investigation for colluding with a self-serving source and concealing the origin of evidence, and she filed a separate indictment against Bo Mercer for providing false information to a federal agency and committing fraud during judicial proceedings. 3 files submitted in the same morning, 3 bombs falling at once, and by noon, the entire Moynihan courthouse knew. Gould called her into his office at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He stood behind his desk, his face red, the vein at his temple raised, and spoke in a voice he clearly thought sounded threatening. Do you know what you've just done, Davenport? You just ended your own career. I'll destroy you. I'll make sure no prosecutor's office in this country ever takes you. Felicity stood at the door, didn't sit, didn't step inside, because she had no intention of staying long. She looked at Gould and spoke in the flat, calm voice she had used before the grand jury, the voice that didn't need rhetoric because the truth was already enough. You can't destroy something you didn't build, Mr. Gould. She turned and walked out without looking back. She knew Gould would do exactly what he said. He would call every connection he had, smear her throughout the legal world, turn her into a traitor to the system. But Felicity had grown up in the foster system, and she knew the system always punished those who dared to say it was wrong. And she also knew that didn't mean the system was right. She drove back to Connecticut in the late afternoon, and she didn't know that while she had been confronting Gould, Bo's final move had already begun to have consequences. The remnants of the Hale organization, the men Knox had crushed financially but not erased as people, had received information from Bo. Knox Mercer had a biological sister, named Felicity Davenport, and she was staying at the Connecticut mansion. And for men who had lost everything because of Knox, an unprotected blood sister was the perfect chance for revenge. 9 o'clock at night. The Mercer mansion was quiet. Marnie had fed Maeve dinner and was bathing her on the second floor. Knox was in his first-floor study, on the phone with Colton, about the legal fallout from what Felicity had just done. Perry stood by the front door, checking the security system the way he did every night. Felicity sat in the basement library, rereading the Briggs file one final time. The sound of breaking glass came from the first floor, from the dining room window, and it wasn't the sound of glass breaking by accident. It was the sound of glass being shattered on purpose, quick and clean. Perry reacted within 3 seconds. He shouted 2 things at once, one to Knox, first-floor breach, and one to Marnie on the second floor. "Miss Marnie, take baby Maeve to the 3rd floor now. Safe room, lock the door." Felicity heard the shout from the basement, and she didn't run down to the 1st floor. She didn't run out the back door. She ran up the stairs, past the 1st floor where she caught a brief glimpse of Perry and Knox moving toward the dining room, up to the 2nd floor where Marnie was holding baby Maeve wrapped in a still damp bath towel, and she grabbed Marnie's hand, pulling both of them up to the 3rd floor. The safe room was at the end of the 3rd floor hallway, steel door, passcode lock, and Knox had shown her the code on the first day she came to stay, because he had said that if anything happened, she needed to know the safest place in the house. Felicity entered the code, opened the door, pushed Marnie and Maeve inside, stepped in after them, and locked the door from the inside. Maeve cried, not screaming, but crying with fear, the small, trembling cry of a 3-year-old child who didn't understand what was happening. Felicity sat down on the floor, pulled the little girl into her lap, and began telling a story. She didn't know what story she was telling. She just spoke. In the calmest voice she had, the voice she had spent her whole life training, because she knew a calm voice was the only thing that could keep a child from panicking, because she had once been that child, and no one had spoken to her in a calm voice. She told a story about a stray cat finding its way home, making it up on the spot. And Maeve stopped crying, clutched Felicity's shirt, and listened. Marnie sat beside them, holding Felicity's hand, an old, calloused hand holding a young one, and she said nothing, because she didn't need to say anything. She only needed to be there. Downstairs, Knox and Perry handled the 3 intruders. Fast, efficient. Not a single gunshot, because Knox didn't use guns inside his own house. Not because he was merciful, but because he didn't want Maeve to hear gunfire, and there were lines even a Mafia boss wouldn't cross. 15 minutes passed from the moment the glass broke to the moment silence returned. Knox went up to the 3rd floor, walked down the hallway, stopped in front of the steel door of the safe room, and knocked 3 slow times, the signal he had taught Felicity. She opened the door. Knox looked into the room. Felicity sat on the floor, her back against the wall, Maeve asleep in her lap, the child's head resting against her chest, her small hand still gripping Felicity's shirt. Marnie sat beside her, holding Felicity's hand, and Knox Mercer, the man who had just dealt with 3 intruders with his bare hands without blinking, looked at that scene and went down on his knees, not because he was exhausted, not for drama, but because his knees could no longer keep him standing when he saw his sister, the one he had searched for across 25 years, embracing the orphaned child he had saved, and protecting his family in the way he hadn't been able to protect her when she was 4. "Are you all right?" His voice was hoarse. Felicity looked at him. Her eyes were tired, her hair was messy, and on his sleeve there was a smear of blood she knew wasn't his. She looked at the blood, then looked into his eyes, gray eyes exactly like hers, and said, "Don't call me Miss Davenport anymore." Knox looked at her. "Then what do I call you?" Felicity looked down at Maeve sleeping in her lap, the little girl she had told a story to in the calmest voice of her life, then looked back up at him. "Any name you want, as long as you call." 2 days after the night the mansion was attacked, Felicity sat in the living room writing a motion she knew would end everything she had built. A formal recusal motion, withdrawing from the Knox Mercer case on the grounds of a family conflict of interest, with full disclosure of the blood relationship between herself and the defendant. She wrote the motion by hand first, on paper, because she needed to feel the weight of each word through the tip of the pen before typing it. She wrote that she was Felicity Davenport, a federal prosecutor, and that she was also Rosalind Mercer, Knox Mercer's biological sister. She wrote that she had discovered this relationship during the investigation and had continued prosecuting after learning it, that it was a breach of professional ethics, and that she took full responsibility. She wrote that she requested to be removed from the case and recommended the appointment of a replacement prosecutor with no conflict of interest. She didn't write that she was giving up the only thing she had ever built for herself in her life. She didn't need to write it, because everyone would understand that on their own. She typed the motion, signed it, scanned it, and emailed it to the SDNY Oversight Board, the Federal Judicial Council, and the Attorney General's office at 8:15 on Wednesday morning. By 10 o'clock, her phone began ringing and didn't stop. Colleagues, reporters, opposing counsel, acquaintances in the legal world, all of them wanted to know whether she had lost her mind. A federal prosecutor publicly revealing that she was the sister of the Mafia boss she was prosecuting wasn't just recusal, it was professional suicide, and everyone in the field knew she would never stand before a jury in New York again. Felicity turned off her phone, set it on the table, and walked out to the back garden, sitting on the steps where she had once seen Knox reading to Maeve. She sat there alone, looking out over the bay, and she didn't cry. She had cried enough. She simply sat and felt the weight of what she had just released. Her career, her identity as a prosecutor, the person she had built across 15 years from the group home to law school to the SDNY. All of it for a man whom 3 months earlier she had known only through a surveillance photograph taped to her wall, and whom she now called by a name the 4-year-old child inside her had called in her sleep for 10 years. On the other side of the mansion, Colton Price called Knox. Knox answered in his study, with Perry standing beside him. Colton spoke in the flat voice of a lawyer, delivering facts without adding opinion. She withdrew from the case, officially, publicly. She disclosed her family relationship with you to the entire federal justice system. Her career at the SDNY is over. Knox didn't answer. Colton waited 5 seconds, then added, "She gave up her career for you, Knox." Knox looked out the window, where he could see Felicity's silhouette sitting on the back steps, her back straight, alone, looking out at the bay, and he said, his voice quiet but certain, "Not for me, for justice. There's a difference, and that's why she's better than all of us." Knox hung up. Perry looked at him but said nothing, because there were moments when silence was the only right thing. Knox sat at his desk all afternoon, calling no one, meeting no one. He opened the bottom drawer, took out the tin box, and removed the third letter, the one he had written on the night he received the DNA results and never sent. He read it again from the beginning, 3 pages. His handwriting was hard and angular, the handwriting of a man more used to signing orders than writing letters. But every sentence in this letter wasn't an order. It was the closest thing to honesty Knox Mercer had ever put on paper. He wrote about October 12th, 1999. About the 12-year-old boy running along the sidewalk, calling his sister's name. About the pink bracelet lying beside the maple tree. He wrote about their mother. About her scream beneath the spinning police lights. About the 2 years in which she withered until there was nothing left to wither. He wrote about their father. About the stacks of missing children's files on the desk where he died. He wrote about 25 years of opening the tin box every night. About the hundreds of file boxes in the basement. About the hundreds of false leads. The hundreds of faces that weren't hers. And at the end of the letter, he wrote, "I don't know how to be a brother. I only know how to be a boss. I know how to give orders, how to control, how to make people afraid. But I don't know how to talk to you without making everything sound like an interrogation. I don't know how to care for you without turning it into control. I don't know how to be close to you without fearing that closeness will put you in danger. But if you give me time, I'll learn. I learned how to wait for 25 years. I can learn more." Knox folded the letter along the same old creases, stood, and went up to the second floor. Felicity's room was at the end of the hallway, the door half closed, the lights off, and she hadn't come upstairs yet. He stepped inside, placed the letter on her pillow, and walked out. He didn't look back at the room, because if he looked back, he would take the letter back and hide it in the tin box the way he had done before, and this time he didn't want to hide it anymore. Felicity went up to her room close to 11 o'clock that night. She saw the letter on the pillow, recognized the angular handwriting she had seen on hundreds of documents in the case file, and sat on the edge of the bed, turned on the bedside lamp, and read. She read all 3 pages. She read about the day she was taken through the eyes of a 12-year-old boy standing on the sidewalk. She read about her mother, the woman of whom she didn't have a single memory, but who had died because she lost her. She read about her father, the man whose face she had never known, but who had died at his desk among stacks of files searching for her. And she read the final line, "If you give me time, I'll learn." I learned how to wait for 25 years, and tears fell again. But this time she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall onto the paper. And she didn't hate herself for crying. She folded the letter, put it in the nightstand drawer, turned off the light, and lay down. The next morning, Knox came down to his study at 5 o'clock, as he did every day. He sat at the desk, reached for the newspaper, and saw, on the coffee table, right beside the cup of ginger tea Felicity had begun making for him every night, a small piece of paper torn from a notebook. The handwriting was round, small, and neat, completely different from his angular script. One single line. You don't need to learn. You've been my brother since the moment you kept the bracelet. Knox read the line. He read it again. Then he folded the small piece of paper very carefully and opened the bottom drawer. He opened the tin box, placed the paper beside the pink plastic bracelet, the lock of hair, the scribbled drawing, and the empty space where the third letter had rested for 25 years. The tin box was lighter now because the letter was gone, but heavier because it held his sister's words, and Knox realized it was the most worthwhile exchange of his life. 1 year later, the Knox-Mercer case did not end with the sound of a judge's gavel striking in a packed courtroom, but with a quiet morning at the Moynihan courthouse. A newly appointed judge after Briggs was removed from the bench, a courtroom far emptier than the press had expected, and Knox-Mercer, standing before the court in a charcoal gray suit for the last time. The prosecutor replacing Felicity was a middle-aged man from Washington, with no conflict of interest and no Gould pulling strings behind him, and with most of the strongest evidence thrown out because of its dirty origins through Bowe and Briggs's corrupt channel. The case weakened considerably. The final sentence was a financial penalty, 3 years of federal probation, and the complete dissolution of the illegal side of Mercer Holdings. Knox accepted it without appeal. Colton Price called it commercial suicide. Perry Shaw called it insanity. Knox didn't call it anything at all. He simply signed the papers, shook his lawyer's hand, walked out of the courthouse, and drove back to Connecticut. For the first time in Mercer family history, a boss chose to shrink the empire instead of fighting to the end. And the reason wasn't that he had lost, but that he had decided there was something more important than winning. Bowe Mercer received 8 years in federal prison for collusion, fraud in the proceedings, and incitement to violence. Bowe's trial moved quickly, because the evidence against him was clean evidence, the kind Felicity had built before she withdrew from the case. Knox didn't attend his cousin's trial. He didn't visit. He didn't send a lawyer. Bowe Mercer walked into the federal prison in Otisville, New York, and the iron door closed behind him without a single Mercer looking back. Judge Catherine Briggs was permanently removed from the bench by the Federal Judicial Council, after the investigation confirmed the offshore account and the financial ties to the Hale organization. She was awaiting criminal trial on charges of bribery and obstruction of justice, and though she hadn't pleaded guilty, her 40-year career had ended with the image of her walking out of court in handcuffs, broadcast by every news station. Nelson Gould was suspended from his position and was under internal investigation, the political career he had waited for all his life turning to dust within 1 week after Felicity made the file public. The surviving remnants of the Hale organization, who had breached the mansion, were swiftly handed over to federal authorities, ensuring the final remnants of Warren's legacy were permanently dismantled. Felicity Davenport left the SDNY, but she didn't leave the law. She opened a small law office in Westport, Connecticut, 20 minutes by car from the Mercer Mansion, specializing in free legal defense for children in the foster system. Children like she had once been, nameless, rootless, with no one standing on their side in court. She used her official name on the office sign and on every legal document. Felicity Rosalind Mercer Davenport, attorney at law. She kept both surnames, because she was both of those people. The orphaned child saved by a Vermont farmer, and the little sister a Mafia boss had searched for across 25 years. Mrs. Ruth Davenport moved from Vermont down to Connecticut, into a small house near the mansion that Knox bought, though Mrs. Ruth insisted on paying monthly rent, because she said, "I haven't taken anything from anybody for free my whole life, and I'm not starting now." Knox called her ma'am for the first 3 months until Mrs. Ruth looked at him across the dinner table and said, "Call me Mrs. Ruth. I'm not the queen," and Knox obeyed. Perry later told Marnie about that moment and said it was the first time in 14 years he had seen Knox Mercer take orders from anyone. Baby Maeve, now 4 years old, called Felicity Aunt Fell, and that was the sound the whole house waited to hear each morning when the little girl ran down the stairs. The official adoption papers to make little Maeve a legal member of the Mercer family were filed in August, proud by co-signed by both Knox Mercer and Felicity Rosalind Mercer Davenport. One autumn evening, when the fire in the hearth had burned low and Maeve was asleep upstairs, Felicity stepped into Knox's study and placed a cup of ginger tea on the corner of his desk, in the same old spot as she had done every night for the past year. Knox looked at the cup. Steam rose in the lamplight, and Felicity stood in the doorway, her shoulder resting against the frame, watching him. "Why don't you ever drink it right away?" Knox looked at the tea, then at her. "Because I want to remember that you're in the next room. I spent 25 years looking at a bracelet in a tin box and wondering where you were. Now I look at this cup of tea and know you're here. I want to remember that feeling longer than one sip of tea." Felicity stood in the doorway, her eyes wet, but she smiled, and it was a real smile. Not the polite smile before a jury, not the defensive smile of an orphaned child, but the smile of a woman standing inside her family's home and knowing she belonged there. "You found the cup of tea. This time, not too late." Knox looked at her. "This time, not too late." Felicity turned and went back to her room. Knox watched her go, then opened the bottom drawer and took out the tin box one final time. Inside now were the pink plastic bracelet, the lock of hair, the scribbled drawing, Felicity's handwritten note, and something new, a small card printed in black letters on a white background. Felicity Rosalind Mercer Davenport, attorney at law, with a Westport, Connecticut address, phone number, and email. She had placed it in the tin box at some point without him knowing, and Knox looked at the card lying beside the plastic bracelet the 12-year-old boy had picked up from a Newark sidewalk 25 years earlier. He closed the tin box, gently, and for the first time in 25 years, he closed the lid without feeling loss. Outside the window, Connecticut autumn lay quiet, leaves changing color on the oak trees along the drive, the surface of Long Island Sound reflecting the moon, and in the kitchen Marnie was washing the last cup before turning off the lights. Upstairs, Maeve slept in her pale yellow room, kicking the blanket off with one foot, and in the next room, Mrs. Ruth read a book beneath her bedside lamp. At the end of the hallway, Felicity lay in the bed in the room Knox had said was hers, and she had stopped correcting him long ago, and Knox Mercer sat in his study, in silence. But this was not the silence he had lived with for 25 years. The silence of absence, of empty rooms, of the tin box, opened every night. This was the silence of a house with enough people inside to fill it. This story is not only a story about mafia, about courtrooms, or about powerful people. This is the story of a brother who never stopped searching, and a sister who never stopped calling his name in her sleep, even when she didn't know who she was calling. This is the story of what it means to be found. After everything, after 25 years, after all that was lost and broken, there was still someone holding your pink plastic bracelet and waiting for you to come home. The greatest lesson this story leaves behind is that family is not only what you are born with. Family is what you choose to keep searching for every day, even when the world tells you to give up. And sometimes, the person you have been searching for all your life is standing right across from you in a courtroom, and all you need to do is recognize them in time. If you have stayed with this story all the way to the end, thank you from the bottom of my heart. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of anyone in your real life? A brother, a sister, a parent, or someone who once searched for you, or someone you are still searching for? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every comment, and we want to listen to what is deep inside your heart. If this story touched you, please like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now so you don't miss the next stories every day. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every single day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.